obsolete.
There is a regime called human rights. It has been created for the last 50 years to deal with every struggle human beings have struggled with. It has conventions and covenants that deal with practically every issue. Some people say it's full, some not. It really doesn't matter. I believe if tomorrow we didn't create any new convention or any new covenant and only took to implement and enforce what we have, it will be heaven on earth.
The two main covenants which serve as a legal expression of universal human rights were drafted during the 1960s. One covers civil and political rights.
People, rise up, yeah, people, rise
The
up.
other encompasses economic, social, and cultural rights.
Yeah, people, rise up.
Together with the Universal Declaration, these documents make up the International Bill of Human Rights. In the beginning, all the rights of the Universal Declaration were considered indivisible. But with the Cold War, hostility between capitalism and communism caused a division between economic and civil rights. Countries in the West objected to being accountable for economic and social rights, which might interfere with the free market. And the Eastern Bloc had a problem with civil and political rights, which might undermine their ability to fully control their economies. For most people in North America, human rights are a distant problem faced by people in other countries. We see our problems as minor in comparison and think they can be addressed by the free market and by using the democratic process. The idea that we live in an ideal society has helped to keep us in the dark about economic, social, and cultural rights and what they might mean to us. This, along with the pressure to reduce government's role, has led our leaders to believe they are no longer accountable to human rights obligations. In Canada and the US, for example, the idea that an adequate standard of living is a right has long been dismissed as ridiculous and somehow anti-democratic. Yet for too many people, even basic needs are no longer being met.
And the governments, having erected these standards, ought to be bound by them. And in particular the case in economic and social areas, suddenly get changed by a government. And so people are looking for a standard, a reference point, a center to refer to. And the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is one of those. And it talks about daily life. I mean, it's talking about the right to employment. It's talking about and the conditions of employment and your right to organize where you're employed. It's talking about the right to basic subsistence in terms of food, in terms of shelter and housing, and various aspects of social participation. It's talking about health. And so people say, well, wherever you are, whatever your condition, whatever your background, whether you're working or not, these are some basic standards about how we measure what it means to be human, to be fully human, and to enjoy your humanity and your society.
There have, of course, been many people in positions of great power who prefer not to let human rights be the prime directive of civilization, because this might limit their pursuit of power and wealth. Since the early days of the United Nations, there have been people in high places safeguarding the interests of the corporate global elite, undermining the enforceability and accountability of human rights laws. It has been a struggle for 50 years, and it's far from over.
The enjoyment of these basic human rights has been held up by a number of factors. Governments have been very sort of mealy-mouthed about them. And also, when people have taken some of these issues to court, they found that the judges either are ignorant of these rights or interpret them in an extremely narrow or limited fashion. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of educating judges and officials as well as the public about the basic human rights instruments.
Most things that happen to poor people in this country go unnoticed and happen in silence, happen in isolation. We realized that when we went to talk to the federal government about what was going on, there was no accountability left to basic human rights. And it's always been our position that civil and political rights, the right to vote, all of that is meaningless in the absence of having your basic needs met. I mean, so what if you can go and vote? What if you don't have a home? What's it going to do for you? Nothing.
I mean, it was only a couple of years ago I had an American Express card and everything. I had It's a station wagon, a van, and a motorcycle, you know. I mean, I don't always live like this.
You know, here we were in a country where people weren't aware of basic human rights and where there was no accountability mechanism. And then we discovered that Canada was being assessed by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So we felt, you know, this was a great opportunity to report on exactly how Canada is basically, on the one hand, promoting rights and on the other hand, violating them. Canada ratified the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant in 1976. Over the past several decades, UN committees have been set up to oversee human rights covenants and assess governments' accountability to the agreements they signed.
What has been stated is the positive side of that, which is... In
1998, it was Canada's turn to report to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Representatives from non-government organizations were also in Geneva to report to the same UN committee that would later hear from the Canadian government.
Drastic cuts to social assistance and the coercive requirements of workfare represent serious backward steps and multiple violations of the rights of the covenant. Adequate housing and heat and light is essential for survival during Ontario's long cold winters. Yet housing is not a right, nor even a government priority. It is now about 56% of homeless people who are families with children, of whom 37% are single-parent families.
Many Canadians have been very worried about increasing poverty and suffering, which have been caused in part by major changes in the way federal and provincial governments fund and deliver social programs. Every program from education to housing, from health to welfare, has been cut back and redesigned to reduce access to these basic needs.
The past 5 years have seen the most dramatic reversal of social and economic equalization initiatives since Canada's social security system was set up over 30 years ago. One of the most profound changes to Canada's social security framework came with the elimination of the Canada Assistance Plan, or CAP.
Under these cuts, certain vulnerable groups have been unduly hurt.
The main thrust of the questions asked by the UN Committee to Canadian government officials showed their concern over reports about the decay of basic social programs and the devastating impact on the vulnerable and poor in a wealthy country like Canada.
Okay, my question is this: would it be in order for Canada to tell the provinces to take into consideration these vulnerable groups when they allocate social security benefits?
If, for example, a woman who is battered by her husband wants to leave her husband, she can't, because she doesn't have enough money. She has no job. If she goes on welfare, she can't get enough welfare to support herself or her children.
Growing homelessness, families and single mothers, the fastest growing group. Social housing supply programs terminated. Tenant protections dramatically decreased. Rent control effectively ended.
The federal government opened an armory in Calgary. The city of Calgary has a particular problem with the shortage of housing.
The Canadian delegation struggled to answer the committee and tried to avoid some of the more difficult questions.
With respect to violence against women, the federal government has taken a holistic and multidisciplinary approach.
When we talk about obligatory or workfare, what exactly does that mean? I think to answer a question like the one which has been asked, we have to examine the program in question. The question of actions by the Ontario government, if my notes are correct. Again, I can't answer for the Ontario government. I'm prepared to pursue any specific information that I can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The UN committee pointed to the vacuum of accountability between the provinces and the federal government, which allows them to pass the buck back and forth over who is responsible for the damage they have both created.
It's a glaring fact that CHST leaves the door open to each province to do whatever it wants. Forget about social welfare if it wants to, or give minimum if it wants to.
The CAP did not establish a national system of social standards. Did not. Therefore, the fact that the CHST does not is not a retrogressive move.
Since you mentioned 3 times that the CAP does not, and you said, I repeat, does not set national standards. I would like to quote to you from your own report, Mr. Ambassador, from the Canadian report. This is a United Nations document dated 25 January 1992, page 8, paragraph 40. You said in that report that CAP set a uniform minimum national standard, and that the CAP sets out certain standards for the provinces. And today you said 3 times that it does not. So which of these things now are misrepresented? The former report or now? I would like to know the explanation why you have contradictory statements in your own report.
The question is there indeed a significant legal vacuum, and are there no techniques which the federal government can and does use to minimise any such vacuum?
The Canadian constitutional system is complex. There are shared jurisdictions as between the federal and provincial governments, and insofar as a treaty or an international convention relates to an area which obtains to the provincial jurisdiction, this jurisdiction is exclusive, and the federal government cannot impose something that comes under the jurisdiction of a provincial government.
The committee's concluding observations made national news headlines in Canada. Among the committee's recommendations were national standards for social programs and immediate action to provide housing for the homeless.
The decision of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is going to have a huge impact in terms of our ability to regain lost ground as a result of the last 5 years of program spending cuts. I think that what often happens is when people begin to lose their rights, or when they are increasingly persecuted or oppressed, there's a tendency to fall back and allow that process to happen and believe that there's no way to stop it, that it's just going to come and keep on coming, and we're just going to sort of huddle and try and protect ourselves. And I think the Geneva process was a demonstration that it's possible to actually fight back and win.
Canada has more than enough capacity and resources to uphold the rights of the covenant.
And I think that type of win is very important to building an organization and mobilizing a force to not just stop what's happening, but actually move forward.
Human rights are more important now than they have ever been, because free trade agreements like NAFTA and the WTO threaten to overrule human rights and undermine governments' ability to protect national laws and standards.
Our argument is that the World Trade Organization and all trade organizations should be subject to international human rights treaties, including the International Bill of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, the International Labor Conventions. You know, that's the way things should be done. But right now it's vice versa.
Human rights laws were drafted and ratified long before trade agreements and by a much more democratic process. They should be exercised to restrain the exploitive and dangerous power of trade agreements.
Use the language of human rights. Stop fighting for housing, stop fighting for clean water, stop fighting for education, fight for human rights. Use the human rights language. It's so powerful. It creates a feeling, what I say is a common vision.
Worldwide, people are waking up to the fact that human rights laws are vitally important for the future of humanity and the planet. Those of us who live in rich countries where the wealthy benefit the most from global exploitation must get involved in defending the human rights of everyone.
We will not be divided, united!
We want to see a clear recognition in the Canadian Human Rights Act that these international standards that we've part of and that the federal and provincial governments have signed on to are brought right into Canadian law, and then you can take the government or others to court.
So far, the government has not responded to the UN Committee's recommendations. Neither have they done anything to improve the lives of people most affected by recent events.
But of course, that's basically for cooking. We have kerosene lantern each. A certain amount of housing should be a right.
It's essentially a matter of identifying the things that poor people themselves feel are violations of their human rights, and to start to articulate those as human rights issues rather than as issues of charity or program policy or social policy. And so what we find is that the way in which poor people naturally speak about rights is usually in good conformity with the international human rights provisions that Canada has ratified.
Canada has ratified almost all international human rights laws, has made its global reputation on defending these rights, and has the resources and the capacity to uphold and respect the full range of universal human rights. At the same time, corporate interests from the IMF to the Business Council on National Issues, who dictate our budget decisions and pre-draft our laws, have hijacked Canada. This is ground zero in the struggle between human rights and corporate rights. The time to act is now.
Rise up, yeah, people, rise up.